Let's look at the most vital aspect of watercolor painting, how much water sits on the paper and how this works with your painting and the effect that you want. Be it gloss, where the water sits on top of the paper, the sheen effect, where you get the most varied aspects of paint, and the matte, which is a little more controllable, and absolute dry when you get those fine details and sharp lines. Right now, I'm just going to use these two brushes. Let's talk about something that very few teachers actually talk about, and that is how much water to use. How wet should the paint be? How wet should the paper be? How wet should your brushes be? The balance between paper, water, and pigment are vital to watercolor. And one of the best things about watercolor is the fact that it's beautifully transparent when we use it correctly. We want that paper to shine through the layers of pigment. It gives the painting a luminosity that almost no other medium can acquire. But how much do we use? I start out with my palette. My station is set up, ready to go. I have my two waters, my dirty water and my clean water. My brushes to sit on my sponge. My palette is fairly clean. And as I mentioned before, I often use this little bit of leftover paint at the edges to neutralize some of my colors in the middle. When I come in to the studio before I'm going to paint, the first thing I always do is I wet my paints. I dribble a little bit of water into each one because I allow my paints to dry in the wells between paintings. I'm from New England and we're rather frugal. So we like to save things, and I've gotten used to that. So I put the water in as I'm setting up everything else, and that helps my paints to soften before I use them. I'm going to wet each of my brushes, my brush, so it's wet, because the brushes are going to act like a sponge to absorb the paint and the water as we go along. And if we start with a very dry brush, it's not going to pick up the paint the way we want it to. So we prepare our brushes, we prepared the paint, and we have our water ready to go. There are 4 stages of wetness of the water. Those 4 stages are on my list, but I always keep them nearby as well to have that balance between water and paint. We have gloss, sheen, matte, and dry. So gloss is when the paper is very, very wet. We're going to pick up a good amount of water with our brush and apply it to the paper right here. And if you could see this up close, you could see that the paper is very, very wet in this corner. I don't know if I can do the light to make it shine or not. Anyway, it's very wet, and how you look at it is you can pick up your paper or bend it down and look at an angle to the light to see how wet your paper is. Right now, it is very, very wet. So that is my gloss. My second stage is my sheen. My sheen is when there's water sitting on the surface of the paper, but it's not shiny glossy. It doesn't look like glass. You can see a little bit of the texture through the water, the texture of the paper. Matte is when you've put it on and it starts to dry, and there's more of the texture of the paper showing than there is the water. And then of course we have very dry, just dry paper down in this corner. Those are the 4 stages. So here I'm going to wet this again, and let's pick up some pigment and see what happens as we apply it in each of these areas. I'm going to come to my palette. I'm going to pick up some of this phthalo blue. You want to pick it up, put it into your mixing area, and mix it thoroughly, slightly twisting your brush as you're mixing it so that that paint is included in all areas of your brush. Not just, let me show you with this one, not just pick up a little bit there and then it's a lot of paint on one side and not much on the other side. That's not what we want. We want our brush saturated with that beautiful color. This is my sheen. I am going to drop some paint into that and just watch how that bleeds out. If you want that effect, that paint is going to run everywhere. And that's my glossy area. In my sheen area, I can do the same thing, but it's not quite as wet. So it will bleed some, but not as uncontrollably as the gloss section. And then in my matte section, which this has dried, that's another thing we need to be aware of, is how dry the room is that we are in, or if we're outside. Is it a humid day? It is a dry day. Be very aware of that, because that will affect how fast your paper dries. Now pick up some more paint. Again, notice how I twist and turn my brush. I even actually turn it in my hand. You don't see that as much, but I am doing that. And now I'm coming over to my matte section. I'm going to put some brush strokes there. And you can see it's bleeding again, not as much as this, and definitely not as much as this. And then in my dry paper section, you can see how that works. This is something that is vital, absolutely vital to watercolor painting. We want to know the wetness of our paper and how much we can control or not be able to control the paint. This wetness up here, the gloss and the sheen, are those areas of watercolor where we want to allow the paint to take its own course, to find its own adventure. And we'll sit back and we'll just kind of watch it as it settles in and decide what it wants to do. This area, this dry brush area, on the dry paper, we have a lot of control. But then it doesn't get that beautiful flowing wash color. I have picked up now a little bit of my burnt sienna, and let's see how this reacts mixing in. This is dried a bit, but there are still very wet areas, and I'll bring that across. And we can see how that is affecting the color that's already there. Again, pick up here, coming across this way, and once more, whoops, clean my brush in my dirty water, then touch it again to my clean water. I'm touching it to my sponge to dry it slightly. Pick up more paint and come across my matte section with some brush strokes. And again, the dry section. You can see how in this gloss section it's really run a lot. It has gone, I have Look out, it's still so wet, it just bleeds out there. It's having a party with itself. It's wonderful. This has more control, a little more control than that, and then the dry gives us absolute sharp lines, defined colors, very easy to control. Depending on what we want to paint, do we want to paint clouds or water? We may want to stay in this section of the gloss and the sheen because the pigment goes into that water and plays around and spreads itself through the water and then settles down where it wants to be on the paper. Where if we have drier paper, like the dry paper and the matte, here we can get some nice little bleeding in this area along the edge here, subtle bleeding as opposed to this wild, fun bleeding up here, little subtle blossoms. That can be used in a very different area of a painting than these sharp lines. So practice and play on some scrap paper and see what different amounts of water will do with your paint. As you become familiar with those, and it takes more than just this one time to play with it, you need to play with it again and again and again until you're comfortable and have a good idea as to the personality of your specific paper, the personalities and characteristics of your paints, all combined with how much water is sitting on your paper. The more time you spend with it, the more you will understand it, and the better your paintings will be because you will have more control and ideas as to where your paint is going to go. Again, this could be great for clouds. This soft blending here would be wonderful for distant mountains and trees. The sharpness would be great for the edges of buildings against a bright light in the background. So play around with that. I'm going to pick up my wide flat brush again. As you notice, I basically use two types of brushes, my flat brush and my wash brush with a nice point on it. And this flat brush also comes to a nice chiseled edge. And this is my calligraphy brush. I just use that. I have that around because, I don't know, it's my favorite. All right, so let's play with some little landscape here. If you're more comfortable, you can draw in a couple little hills, but it's even more fun not to do that. Let's play with this. I'm going to throw up a good amount of water at the top. If you want, you can even use one of your spray bottles. Be sure to check it off to the side to see how much spray you have coming out of it before you apply it to your paper. Tilt your head in the direction of your light so you can see how much water is sitting on the top of your paper. A good amount of this is between the gloss and the sheen stage. So I am going to start a deep cloud. I am mixing what I already have out here, my Prussian blue with some burnt umber. Makes a beautiful gray. Saturate my brush as you see me doing that. And now let's throw it into that wonderful area. That's great. Nice dark clouds. Let's get some more blue in there. And then as I come down, I'm touching my sponge to remove a little of that water. I'm picking up some more blue. I'm going to add some sharper lines down in here. And as you notice, I stayed very light with the water along that edge of that mountain because I want that to be a little sharper line. I want the light coming down in behind this mountain. This I am just taking clear water, touching it to the edge of some of these paints, and watch how it bleeds down. Look at that. It looks so natural when it does that. I'd like to see a little more dark up in here, picking up a good amount of pigment, thinking clouds, more pigment. And then I'm going to kind of just let that dry as a dramatic cloud line. First though, I'm going to have a little fun. I'm going to add a little bit of, not yellow because I've got so much blue there that the yellow would make it look green. I'm going to add a cool magenta or alizarin crimson bit down in here just for some fun. That's a little too bright, so I'm going to add a little more water. That's how we make the paints lighter, by adding more water. We have to keep a good eye on the painting. We want to watch to see if this is going to bleed nicely, if this is really against what we wanted that paint to do. This would be the time to soften it. I'm taking clear water. I'm going to soften this lower edge like that. Yeah. I'm also putting some water there. I'm going to let that edge dry right there along that pencil mark to matte. And then I'm going to bring in some ground color like grass or something and hope that that gets this matte bleeding to show like little tiny trees off in the distance. Meanwhile, while I'm thinking about what color am I going to put down here, I have to keep an eye on what's happening up here. I see a blob right here. Be careful not to play around too much with stuff because you can mess it up. Sometimes it's better just to leave it alone. But that's still fairly damp up in that corner, so I am going to soften that, kind of fix that little mistake. Nice deep dark cloud happening here. I think I'd like to balance that out with another kind of darker cloud over in this area. I'm just dropping in paint, picking it up over here, just touching the paper where it's still wet and letting it bleed out. So that's why I was keeping an eye on this section here. And as I come down into the ground, I'm going to keep another eye on that. The best thing to do is once you have a nice area, leave it alone and let it follow its own path. I don't like this heavy thing. I'm going to try to lift. I have a clean, damp brush, and I'm just going to twist and lift across there. So I just took my clean, damp brush, and I brought it across by twisting and pulling. I'm turning the brush in my hand as I draw it along. Kind of soften that edge. Again, brush as a sponge. Okay. This looks like that's where my light's going to be coming in. Touch it with the back of your finger. That feels kind of damp. And I'm hoping that this ridge line is now pretty much ready for some grassy color. I want it kind of blue. I can use this same amount of blue that's in the palette already because that'll help it tie in. Check my color off to the side. Looks a little dark. Bring in a touch more water. Notice I'm just touching the corner of my brush in that water so as not to add too much too much water into that brush, because if I took the whole brush with paint on it and stuck it in there, I would have too much water on the brush. So I just want a little corner bit to pick up a tiny bit more. Check the paint again, and here we go. Be bold, make a decision, and stick with it. Of course, this landscape is now under a dark, threatening cloud, so our landscape has to be a little bit darker too. wrong water. Here we go. Bringing that down in. Let it bleed a little bit up into that sky. And also down into itself. So this is our first step. This is now where we have to wait. I shouldn't do anything else to this painting for a bit until this background is dry. I can stand, I can watch what these clouds are doing. I kind of like this. This is a little too sharp a line in here. I want to soften that. Just a damp brush. Lift some of this color. Lifting again is a damp brush. And just dragging it across the surface. Looks like distant hills. I'm not getting too much of that bleeding. I think my paper got a little dry back there, but that's okay. If I fiddle with it now, it's going to mess it up. So I want to leave it alone and come back to it in a while. When I am painting, because of this waiting stage, I often have 2, 3, 4, or even 5 paintings going at the same time. I put them on separate boards so I can just pick them up, move them off to the side as they dry, and bring in another piece of paper that's already taped down and ready to go. So my suggestion at this point is to go ahead, practice your gloss. Remember when it's wet, 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 and you can see the water sitting on the paper, drop in some color. Your sheen stage, where you can see the water still sitting, but you also see the texture of the paper underneath. Your matte stage, where it's more dry than it is wet. It's heading into, it almost looks dry, but if you touch it with the back of your finger, you can feel that it's still cool, which means there's still water in that paper. And then your dry stage, that you can tell it's dry. You touch that, it's the same temperature as everything else in the room. It is dry. Play around with those with different amounts of texture and paint and things like that, and try a little landscape. At this stage, I'm just playing with this. This is for practice. I don't plan to make this into a great painting. There, I've got a little color in my brush so you can see that glossy stage there. Let's try it one more time. Here's my sheen stage. Dry the brush. Kind of a matte stage. And my dry. So I have 4 areas here on my paper of the 4 steps. 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's grab some color. Look at this one. This is really exciting color. How exciting is that? All right, you can see the little particles floating in that, so it's not very well mixed. I want to make sure that's pretty much dissolved before I go into my painting. Check this, it's still glossy as I look in that sideways into the light. Drop some of that in. Drop it here into my sheen area. Drop some into my matte area. And do the same. I'm using the same brush strokes, and then drop some into my dry area. Clean my brush thoroughly. Dry it on my sponge, pick up a little bit more water, clean water. I'm going to add some of this wonderful sap green. I usually mix my greens, but sap green is just a nice one to have quickly on the paper. Keep playing around with things like this, and you can see what it does. That dried really quickly. My matte section here is just too dry to do much else. It's not really doing much bleeding. Look at this area. Oh, how exciting. And sometimes you can get to that stage, do something between these two stages, step back, let it dry, and then try to create almost an abstract painting out of that. Nothing that you've planned, but you're playing with the watercolor paints and the water on the paper. And it's a game between you. It's an exciting adventure between you, the water, and the paint. Don't forget to practice. Practice a lot. Try different things. You will learn so much that way. Once you're done with this side of the paper and it's dry, pick up that paper, turn it over, do it again on the other side. Do it a number of times until you feel like you now understand how the wetness of the water and the paper work in your watercolors. This is kind of a nice little landscape.